Welcome to About Sustainability, a podcast of the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, or IGES. It's been a while since our last installment, but today's episode is a special interview with a long-serving member of IGES who's had a fascinating career from which he recently retired. Peter King has been based at IGES's office in Bangkok, but has been a mentor and advisor to many of us at IGES. In a wide-ranging discussion, Alice, Shom, Simon and I spoke with Peter about his career, his reasons for choosing it, and the environment in general. Please listen in, especially if you're starting off in any environmental discipline. You're sure to learn something from Peter.
I grew up on a farm, and like other farm kids, I did all sorts of crazy things around the farm, and I picked up a dead bird and put the dead bird in a biscuit tin. Forgot about it for a week or two, and I came back, opened the lid of the biscuit tin, and was amazed to see all of these white maggots. And going, wow, this is magic. So I quickly closed the lid again, came back and opened it again a week or so later, and was amazed to find that the biscuit tin was full of flies. And so this got me thinking about the whole sort of cycle of life and death, and sort of an emerging interest in ecology, I guess, right from very early on. And then when I went to university, I got involved as an activist in an area called the Little Desert, where the government wanted to open up this area of land for returning soldiers to turn it into agricultural properties. And so we went and sat in front of bulldozers and did all the sort of activist things, and eventually convinced the government to declare that area as a national park. And so that was really quite formative. And I graduated from agricultural science, which was my undergraduate degree, and I wanted to work in the environmental field. There were really no jobs. We're talking about 1971, before Stockholm. And so I was sort of really wondering what to do with my life, because I wanted to work in the environmental area, but there were no jobs. Mm-hmm. Went to see, on the recommendation of a colleague, the head of the Soil Conservation Authority. And I sat down and had a nice chat with him. And he said, well, look, you're an interesting guy, but we have no vacancies. And so I stood up and I was about to walk out the door, and he said, hang on a minute. He said, I'm the boss. I can create a vacancy. When can you start?
And this is kind of jumping forward quite a bit, but looking back on your career now, what do you think has been your most important contribution in the field? And perhaps you can also kind of talk not just about your most important contribution, but kind of the spread of contributions that you've made, and then right. Pick out of those what you'd regard as the most significant.
Yeah, I'm a pretty humble person, so I don't really regard anything that I've done as being truly out of the ordinary or having made earth-shattering changes. However, I think setting up the environment department within the Asian Development Bank, and then basically developing a whole portfolio of green-related projects over a 15-year period was a pretty significant contribution to the Asia-Pacific region. And that was in the 1990s. But even prior to that, here in Thailand, I worked on the Tali Sap Songkla development project, which the government at that time was trying to decide whether to put its heavy industry on the east coast or the southern part of Thailand. And through the Tali Sap Songkla project, we were able to prove that the environmental conditions of that area were much better suited to conservation and leaving it alone, essentially, And that led to the government then deciding on putting its heavy industry on the east coast, around the area around Rayong, Pattaya, that area, which has been an environmental disaster for that area. But fortunately, the southern part of Thailand is still relatively pristine.
Peter, why do you think that environmental issues have struggled for attention, alongside other issues for such a long time? And I'm not sure if you share my perception, but that is that they are gaining a lot of ground now, just very recently, perhaps the last 5 years or so. So please say if you disagree with that. But why do you think that they have struggled for so long, first of all? And secondly, why do you think that they're gaining so much prominence recently?
I think there are two main factors. One is humans have become increasingly divorced from nature, and therefore they don't have that innate sense of relationship to natural systems that our ancestors had. And so I think the urbanized masses of the world, they react pretty much to what's in front of them today or the next day. They don't really think about what's going to happen in 30 years or 50 years. Whatever scientists tell them about, what's coming down the pike, it doesn't really change their behavior. They'll be more concerned about where they're going for dinner the next day, or how they're going to get to the office if it's raining. So I think that it's really only sort of imminent disaster that triggers action. And one of the reasons that I think we're starting to see increased attention to environmental issues is because those disasters are actually on our doorstep, with climate change in particular. And so I think that's starting to make people wake up, that this is not something that's far off, but it's actually something which is imminent and getting closer to a realm where those kinds of environmental extremes are going to become the new normal. And we'll have to learn how to either deal with it or live with it. And so I think there is increased attention because of that. The downside of all of that, however, is that I still don't think we've made that connection to nature. And so I think that we still believe that we can engineer our way out of this through technology. But, if you think about it, it's technology that's actually got us into the strife that we're in now. As we went from human power to horsepower to steam power to the internal combustion engine, we've basically engineered our own demise in a sense, and therefore to expect technology to provide the solution to that trajectory, I think is very much mistaken. And how do you then regenerate this connection to nature? And that to me is really the next big dilemma for people working in the environmental field, is how do you convince people that it's a better understanding of ecosystems and our place in ecosystems that will allow us to find solutions to the environmental problems we're facing. And we should not put our trust in technology.
Don't you think that it's important to acknowledge technology as a tool in the toolbox and part of the solution as well, though?
I think there's obviously a role for technology. Technology ultimately allows humans to do more than they can do by themselves. However, if it's not directed in terms of reconnecting us with nature, then I think there's a danger that we're just basically delaying the inevitable demise of the ecosystems in which we find ourselves.
I'm kind of thinking of the eco-modernist argument, and there's also, I don't know if you call him, or I don't know if he calls himself an eco-modernist, but Eric Sanderson and I forget his co-author's name, Joe Walston, I think it is, wrote a really interesting, quite comprehensive article in Bioscience a little while ago, talking about how they thought cities were basically and it's pretty much an eco-modernist argument, I would say. They thought that cities were really the answer to the world's environmental problems because of how they concentrate resources and maximize efficiency, basically. And I mean, they're both environmentalists, but obviously they have their own point of view. But do you think there's anything to that argument? Because, yeah, actually, let me leave it there. I'll have a follow-up question, perhaps. But what do you think of that argument?
I've seen that argument before, that if everyone left the countryside and moved to the cities, then the countryside would have an opportunity to regenerate itself. That to me is a nonsense argument. Regeneration is something that will take increased human attention, particularly as so much of the Earth's surface and waters have been essentially destroyed, that we will need to think very much more about regeneration and our role in doing that. So I'm not entirely convinced that if we're all sitting in high-rise buildings in New York, that we would overcome our environmental issues.
Yeah, another argument against it is that cities increase wealth, and therefore, even though for a given income, cities are much better for the environment, you have the parallel fact that people in cities are generally richer than people outside cities, and therefore, the more people are urban, the bigger the ecological footprint's going to be. But then the counter argument to that then is, but isn't that what we want to do? Isn't that one of our main goals in society is to lift people out of poverty, And people kind of tend to vote with their feet and move to cities because that's where opportunities are, even though they're pretty grim opportunities. They're still better than what they have in the countryside. I'm maybe straying a little bit too far from the discussion, but I just found this fascinating.
I think it's a failure of imagination to go down that path. I think that it doesn't address the issues of many of the developing countries where urbanization is not really the solution. I do a lot of my work in the Pacific Islands, for example, where urbanization is not really a factor. And, you're not going to have high-rise buildings in places like Tuvalu or Kiribati. So while it might be attractive to the American audience, I don't see it applying universally across the developing world.
Mm-hmm. Maybe there's also a connection between resiliency or resilience and, say, where you live. I have this imagination that if you live in the countryside, maybe you're more resilient to environmental changes rather than if you live in a city where all your supplies are depending on, I guess, very efficient supply chains of services, whether it's utilities, electricity, water, the things you buy and consume. And if something happens, like let's say a flood or a huge rainfall or I don't know, a tsunami or other things, then your supply of those necessities might easily be cut. So if we ultimately have to look towards a future where resilience plays a bigger role, maybe everybody living in, what do you call it, like concrete is not going to take us there, I suppose. But there's still the tension, right? What do we do? I mean, can 8 billion people live, I don't know, in a decentralized manner? How do you do this? I also don't have an answer to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're right that it's very dangerous to put all of your eggs in the one basket. So diversity is a really important principle in thinking about ecological systems. And therefore, I think that applies equally to humans. We need diversity, and we need to think about how do we actually get young people in particular to get out into rural areas, into natural systems, and develop that better understanding of how nature is the foundation of our civilization.
I think that people who have some form of interaction with nature, especially when they are young, they wouldn't have any problems making connections. Maybe not intellectually, but, intuitively, they know that nature is good and helpful, is healthy. However, it's actually economic and social factors which force them to be divorced, especially, the lower income people. They simply have no choice, basically. I came to this observation because recently I have been interacting with some people from, let's say, lower levels of income. And then I've asked them about, like what they think about nature, what do they think about organic food. And I'm quite surprised. I mean, these are people, Myanmar refugees. They are all aware of, nature is important. For example, they told me that, okay, we don't want to eat the food from the market because, let's say, if we feed this food to the birds wouldn't eat it. Like they have an intelligence that, nature is, is intelligent. However, they are all working blue collar jobs like security guards. They are just living day by day. They don't have any savings. So they don't have any room for thinking about how to get back to nature, how to protect nature.
Right.
So isn't it, at the end of the day, we really have to change the economic system and the cultural system we live in, whereby people will not be secure to even have basic needs.
Yeah, I think if you look at the capitalist system, the CEOs of some of the big finance companies, the banks, and the big corporations taking home multi-billion-dollar salaries. This kind of inequality is very destructive because these people have a very large influence on what happens throughout the economy.
Mm-hmm.
One of the biggest of environmentalists generally has been how to challenge this capitalist economic system, because we feel powerless actually to make those changes. And so, I think, without some sort of revolution, which I find maybe Extinction Rebellion will sort of get massive support behind them, although I doubt it. I think we're going to have to do that incrementally, chipping away at the power structures that are creating the kind of environmental destruction that we see. I've got faith in doing, class action suits and activist investors within companies. I think there are ways of doing it, but environmentalists are facing a huge battle. They have very, very powerful actors against them, and we see that with the denialism in relation to climate change, which is being funded by the oil and gas and coal industries. It's a battle, and it is a battle that has been going on for at least all of my life, and I would imagine will go on for another 50 years at least.
I was just wondering, so you've been in so many capacities in your lifetime trying to change this socioeconomic system. You've been an activist, you've worked for local authorities, you've worked in research institutes and international organizations. And for someone who's trying to make a difference, someone who's trying to get started in their career, what sort of position do you think is the best at making this difference that we need to do? And I feel like this is where young people might feel most powerless, because it's a big task that we have ahead, and it's difficult to know where to start and how you can actually contribute to this. What do you feel was the best, and what field works the best?
Yeah, I think if I was graduating this year and I was thinking about a career in environmental science one way or another, I would actually think that a good starting place would be to find a job actually working with nature, like a park ranger or doing something that actually is hands-on and would give you a better understanding of what are some of the challenges in managing ecosystems. I think the worst thing you can do is to go directly from your undergraduate degree to a master's degree to a PhD and not have any practical experience. And I'm sorry if that offends anyone, but it's very, very important in my own career to actually have quite a bit of experience before I did my master's degree, and then again several years of experience before I did my PhD. And I was able to use that practical knowledge to further my education. And I think that was really important to allow me to get a better perspective on what was important and how to contribute best. There are many opportunities to do that now with, a lot of the environmental NGOs and others. I think they're a good starting point for young people to get started. I'm not sure that working for government is actually the best way to get started. Eventually working with government, I think, is really important because you need to understand how government actually works.
During the internal talk that we had last time, you mentioned that your daughters told you that you were trying to save the world one report at a time. And I think this really hit home with me because, I feel like this is what we do. And I'm new as a researcher here, but I guess it must be disheartening after publishing so many incredible reports. But once they're published, they're launched into the void and you're not even sure who's reading them, if they're going to make much difference. So I was just wondering how you kept up your motivation across the years.
Well, as I said, I grew up on a farm and we had a very large forest area at the back of the farm where as kids we used to play all the time. Unfortunately, in that forest area, we had a lot of these blood-sucking leeches. And so at the end of playing, I was sitting on a huge granite rock covered with moss, took off all my clothes and searching for these horrible black leeches. And it was a nice sunny day. The sun was streaming down through the trees. And I heard a voice, and the voice said, "I am nature. I am your God, and you will take care of me for the rest of your life." I was so scared, I quickly threw on my clothes, ran all the way home, and I've never, ever forgotten that. Everyone said, "Oh, it must have been your brother or someone tricking you." But no, there was no one else there. I was completely alone. So explain it as you will. It sort of set me up for a life working in the environmental field.
You were basically saying that nature was the answer, right? It was a call that you had. But what if we don't have that call? What if it's not this sort of faith that we have, but we still feel like it's something that we need to achieve because it can't go on?
And you don't see the progress necessarily, right? Like you're putting the time in and the years go by and you don't see any difference at least at the global or the regional level.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult as a researcher to maintain the rage, so to speak. One of the problems that we have is that organizations like IGES, while they're environmental think tanks, they don't really get engaged very much in advocacy and really trying to change behavior. And to me, that's a missing part of our toolbox. You can do as many reports as you like, but if you don't have a way of disseminating that information and really getting it accepted within the community, then you're not going to see change. One way of doing that, of course, is to do co-creation type research with communities and actually getting out in the field a lot more than trying to do your research sitting in Hayama.
If you look back at your several decades of intense involvement in the field of environmental sustainability from various angles, do you feel that, I mean, is it better for the environmental sustainability, shall we say, movement or sector? Is it better if that gets mainstreamed, that it just becomes a very normal professional activity that a broader segment of population engages in, say, making progress towards environmental sustainability? Or is it, if we do so, do we risk colluding with the pre-existing system that is the main barriers to actually making the necessary changes that you have spoken about earlier, where I mean, and actually what I'm thinking about is noble initiatives like the Sustainable Development Goals that are on everybody's mind, and obviously they're helping raising awareness around sustainable development, but they still play in very solidly into the international pre-existing capitalist system. It doesn't shake the boat, or it doesn't really shout at a change that you have actually talked about that might be necessary. So I'm just wondering, are we forceful enough, or are we maybe doing the wrong things, moving in the wrong directions? With your experience, what do you think?
Yeah, I sort of go back to when we first introduced environmental impact assessment. It was very hard to convince my colleagues in the Asian Development Bank that this was just not another hurdle that they had to jump over in preparing development projects. And eventually became mainstreamed. You couldn't do a project without an environmental impact assessment. It largely became a tick-the-box exercise through mainstreaming. And the original intention, which was to use environmental impact assessment as a way of improving project designs, that got forgotten in the process. And so it just became an add-on. You would recruit some consultants and then go and do an environmental impact assessment, and it would be tacked on as an annex to the development project. So I think the SDGs are a bit like that also, that they get tacked on to other things. I don't think they get to the heart of the capitalist conundrum of huge corporations basically destroying nature and disempowering people.
So do you mean that future researchers need to remove those leaves from in front of their mouth and really write about the need for degrowth and steady state? I mean, we've had these things in the margins for several decades, but still we don't really have those discussions front and center, do we? Do we need to?
I think you do need to, but I'm also very much aware of the potential for backlash. Once you go over the edge of what is regarded as polite research findings and start making a noise, and people start listening to that noise, then you can be assured that there will be some form of backlash. And you may not even know exactly where that pressure is coming from, but be assured that it will come. And I think we're seeing a lot of that now with science generally. The elephant in the room to me, when I look at the current situation, is that we're facing massive changes through artificial intelligence, particularly generative artificial intelligence, disinformation and denialism, and genetic manipulation of all sorts. And all of these things are taking place in the name of science. And what it's leading to is the lack of trust in science and in scientists. And if we begin to be regarded as not trustworthy, then we've lost the fight, essentially, because the more powerful actors have all of the equipment and knowledge and abilities to create a false narrative that will be more convincing. And once they start to do that, we're in trouble, because that will just further embody their power and make it much harder for anyone on the environmental side of things to break through that disinformation.
But do you mean that in that sense that our scientific methods have to be more clearly explained or more convincing, so that people can see that what we're doing is sound, or is it that we have to rather speak to the people so that people can understand what's going on? I mean, is it abracadabra, or where are we going?
Well, I think a lot of the problem today is that we rely very heavily on models and modeling, and most people don't understand what's in the black box, and they then question whether or not the findings of the models are actually a true representation of where the environmental climate or other ecosystems are headed. And if there is no trust in the methodologies, then we have a problem in explaining to the public what's coming down the turnpike. So I think a very concerted attempt is needed to rebuild the trust in the scientific method, and to accept that science basically proceeds by making errors and then correcting them, and the whole peer review process is intended to contribute to that. And therefore, one way of doing that, I believe, is to actually bring more diverse voices into the peer review process. And so we could then understand why people don't believe the results of the models.
Just on this topic of mistrust in science, my perception is that, as you alluded to this just now, that uncertainty, science is about uncertainty, right? There is absolutely no certainty in science. It's all about probability or lack of probability, or different degrees of probability, right? And my perception is slightly different or quite different to what it doesn't necessarily contradict what you were saying now, but I think that potentially the mistrust in science at the moment is not so much about the sort of destructive technology that science has produced. And of course, there's a link between science and technology, even though they're not the same thing, but also about what happens when science says something, it then gets oversimplified by the secondary science and the media, and makes its way into the public realm as a very simplistic message, which is not a nuanced reflection of the truth, and then often turns out to be completely untrue because of that oversimplified interpretation. And anyone can sort of search on the web for litanies of predictions that were made in the past that have turned out to be completely wrong, some by some very famous people.
Yeah.
And a lot of these are tied to environmental phenomena. So my point would be, and I'd be curious what you think about this, is that as researchers, we are capable of commenting and maybe advocating for very specific and very maybe quite local scale even suggestions of what should be changed and what can be changed. It's when we try to make these sweeping generalizations that we get into trouble and can go down this kind of road. Because I'm curious, and I don't think anyone's ever been able to study this, but I'm curious how much damage these false predictions have done, how much they have harmed the credibility of science.
No, I think you're right. However, we also need to understand that quite often this disinformation is actually projected by corporations who have an interest in maintaining the status quo. So it's not just the aberrant scientist who's made a mistake in interpreting, or the journalist interpreting some scientific papers. It's also a deliberate process where false projections are put out there. And I think with artificial intelligence now and deep fakes, we're going to find it harder and harder to distinguish between what is true and what is not true, and what is uncertain in between both extremes. And therefore, I think part of the role of scientists in future will be to try to identify the difference between extreme statements of truth and extreme disinformation, and try to convey the nuances related to uncertainties. That's a huge challenge. You're dealing with a public which has never had much in the way of mathematical training. And certainly, most people haven't done statistics, or if they did it, they did one course the first year of university, and then forgot everything about it. That notion of how do you convey the nuances and the uncertainties without sounding like we don't know what we're talking about.
Yeah, and because you don't want to sound like you don't know what you're talking about, because that might not be good for your credibility either. But then you end up sounding so self-assured, so that you maybe create this kind of ivory tower that nobody can relate to, where you end up becoming another elite in society. And I mean, whether science is really an elite in society or not, but it's certainly, I feel that it's being painted in that way. Also, politically, by saying, well, we can't trust any of it anyway, because look, they have made A, B, and C wrong predictions and mistakes, and so therefore, whatever they're saying, that's all wrong. So let's just totally disregard it, and it's a free meal for everyone. And that's what everybody would like to hear anyway, because then we don't have to pay any heed or responsibility to very much, and we can just go on as we used to.
Yeah, and we shouldn't underestimate the power of some of this big thinking as well. One of the most influential books that I ever read was The Limits to Growth, and Schumacher's Small is Beautiful. Even though The Limits to Growth has come in for an enormous amount of criticism and maybe, is well off track in some areas, it has still had enormous influence on a whole generation of scientists working in the environmental area. We shouldn't shy away from trying to do the big picture thinking, but we also need to be a little bit humble about how sure we are that we've actually got it right.
Unless anyone would like to jump in there, I wanted to change direction a little bit. With climate change having such a big sort of share of the media space these days, I heard recently that it receives about 300 times more funding than biodiversity does worldwide. Would you say that it's receiving too large a portion of the attention within the environmental disciplines? I'm sure that we all agree that it would be nice if it could receive more as a share of the total global funding, but looking at it within the environmental space, and perhaps actually more broadly within the development space, because if you think about the SDGs, there's a limited pot of money. It's difficult to prioritize between the different things. So curious to know what you think. And I know that you've thought a lot about climate change as well as biodiversity and pollution and all these different issues, and in the context of human development.
Yeah, well, I think firstly, if we look at the funding that is going into climate change related, most of it's actually going into mitigation, into basically changing the energy system from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And therefore that sort of tips the balance, I think, much more towards climate finance. But the other thing, of course, is that many of the other problems like biodiversity loss, air pollution, water pollution, ocean acidification, those sorts of areas, they're invisible to most people. And because they're invisible to most people, they're invisible to the politicians who are allocating the funding. And so I think part of the role of environmental think tanks like IGES is to actually take on some of these invisible environmental issues and make them visible, make them more visible. And by making them more visible, I think then you can generate some interest. I've been really interested in how plastic pollution has become a big issue. As you know, the negotiations are going on currently for an international treaty in that regard. I have to say that I've been concerned that this has been an issue which has been overblown compared to other environmental issues. I'd be much more concerned about hazardous materials getting into our water supplies with estrogens and pharmaceuticals and things like that, which we are then taking into our bodies, rather than microplastics, which there still hasn't been much evidence of significant health impacts associated with that. In my own opinion, I think oil is actually better devoted to making plastics than it is to fueling internal combustion engines. But I think we underestimate sometimes how important plastics have been in terms of food safety and food preservation. And those sorts of things. Without plastics, without cling wrap, we would have a lot more food waste, for example. It's interesting to me that a particular part of the environmental concerns has generated so much interest recently, and yet in terms of its ranking, perhaps, in terms of environmental issues, I don't see it as the number 2 issue compared to climate change.
Yeah, with the cities, like the story has not changed. Basically, we try and getting people, the average person, to stop using plastic unnecessarily at first, and then to separate the waste at source. But it's not really progressing well at all, and it's been made worse by COVID, unfortunately. So it's been very discouraging for people like us, honestly speaking. However, I want to hear more how you actually divide the issue between microplastics and the macroplastics. Because to me, it's not really divisible. It's actually very closely interlinked, as well as with people are concerned that plastics are getting into the ocean as a pollution problem. But ultimately, it's a health problem, like you said. It's about if the plastic doesn't go into human bodies directly and the chemicals, it goes into the animals, the fish, and then we consume the fish, and in bio accumulates. So the scientific evidence right now is not established on how serious is this issue. We cannot say the endocrine disruptors and all the other chemicals will certainly bioaccumulate, like mercury. It's well established. I'm not sure. I want to hear more how you, and then also about the issue of cling wrap. Yeah. How could it be that, let's say I'm maybe too idealistic. I think like if I were the decision maker, I would ban the production. I think cling wrap should never exist in our society if we clearly, care about sustainability, because it's simply not necessary. Even if you talk about food waste, I was surprised to read some statistics, right? That actually it's not about food waste at all. It's about our system, which is too wasteful. So the statistics says that food is wasted at the production level, even at the production level, without it reaching the retailers and factories. It's about 30%. So 30% is already wasted at the source. And then when it reaches the shops and the factory, it's wasted another 30%. And then when it reaches the consumers, it's wasted another 30%. So you can see that our economic system somehow makes up this wasteful system.
That gets right back to how the industrialization of agriculture and global supply chains have really changed the way people get their food. We used to either grow our own food or we would buy it locally. You buy your eggs from the next door neighbor. That is a system problem, and the plastic part of it is really related, but it may not be the most important part of dealing with this industrial agricultural system. I'm not saying that we shouldn't reduce our plastic consumption. I think we should. And, certainly unnecessary plastic consumption is something that is within the power of all of us. Whenever I go to a 7-Eleven and I'm offered a plastic bag, I'd say, no, thank you. To elevate it to the point of an international treaty without the scientific evidence, I think is jumping the gun.
Yeah, I can see that. I don't know to which extent the evidence actually exists. I mean, I'd be happier not to eat foods that are contaminated with plastics rather than to eat foods that are contaminated with plastics that may or may not be harmful to my children or my own health. But that's probably a luxury problem or first world problem in some sense. And I also think what Shom said when you shared the example of how much 1/3 of food is wasted at production and another third along the supply chain or in the shops. I mean, if you just reduce that food waste, you would actually need 2/3 less plastic packaging. So it's not necessarily about killing off all plastics, but actually getting to a system that is less wasteful. Although the system itself seems to be thriving off the production of waste, and I think that is a problem at a very high level of abstraction, and we need to get to a system that is much less wasteful or that doesn't encourage waste. But for the environmental governance these days, it seems to me almost we need some successes or we need some progress, because it's such a difficult environment to make progress on the environmental issues in. And we are talking about lack of trust in science, but there's also lack of trust in the multilateral system. So they need some success stories now, and urgently so. The SDGs are almost 10 years old, so we need something. So plastic came along, and it seems to be this issue that everyone can relate to. It looks ugly when you're swimming in plastic on the beach, and nobody wants to see plastic in their food, So it seems to be an issue that maybe we can agree on, even though it's maybe not at all the most important issue.
Yeah. Low-hanging fruit, maybe.
Well, Peter, I've been talking to national policymakers, and there seems to be some consensus that when it comes to plastics, a lot of it is unnecessary. Not at all. We have to acknowledge that plastics is really useful, and we should limit it to certain applications, which are, like, let's say, maybe for medicine or for hospitals. Let's say that. But I think it's an issue where people are just using it out of convenience. They are not really thinking through, and you can't count on voluntary behavior to stop the using. And there's the aspect which you raised just now, that plastic is actually enabling the wastefulness of the supply chain. So imagine, for example, if you are not allowed to use cling wrap to store the waste, right, in the shops. So they wouldn't be able to produce that much, right? It would cost a lot more for them to store and keep it fresh. It would totally change the dynamics and the cost of the whole supply chain.
If there is an international treaty to somehow regulate the production and use of plastics, all that's going to happen is that the plastic wraps will be replaced with bioplastics. They will be more expensive, and those costs will be passed on to consumers. And who does it affect? It affects the poor more than the rich. We've got to look at these things more from a systemic perspective, and not it's convenient to take this up because everyone seems to agree with it. So I think some of the environmental policy think tanks need to expand from the work that's currently going on with the INC and relate it back to this global supply chain issue and the industrial agriculture system.
Whichever environmental issue you're looking at, it strikes me that the entry point which is most likely to be successful is to identify how to make the more sustainable options the cheaper options. There are low-hanging fruit there, so there are plenty of cases where that's been done, plenty of low-hanging fruit that are waiting to be picked, and then others which are really hard nuts to crack, but that doesn't mean they can't be cracked, right? But this does take us back to the whole idea of science and innovation and technology, and I think that's why this is one reason why I generally think that it's a mistake to not put enough attention. Of course, we shouldn't rely on scientists and technologists to solve our problems, but I do think that that's a very important part of the solution. So I'm kind of repeating what I said earlier, but with a different caveat this time.
Yeah, and I would also go back to this idea that we need to look more regenerative agriculture and getting people back into more rural settings and away from cities. It's driving these global supply chains, the efficiencies that we referred to earlier. I know in Japan this is a huge problem with the hollowing out of rural areas. And the fact that, there's increasing age of farmers and young people don't want to become farmers. It leaves behind abandoned houses and villages in the rural area and makes Japan increasingly dependent on importing agricultural products. It is then a phenomenon which is repeated in other countries. Same in Australia, where it's a huge landmass, but more than 3/4 of the population is located on the coast. We need to think much more about regenerative agriculture and more sort of, I hate this word, but glocalization. The idea that we need to go back to more sort of local connections rather than seeing us as one big global community linked by huge corporations who are getting obscenely wealthy from a capitalist system that depends on this huge set of global supply chains.
Peter, can I just put up a bit of a fight on the one point that you made there? I think that, this idea of moving out of the cities and into rural areas, I agree if you're talking about developed countries like Australia and Japan. I mean, Japan's a very urbanized country and urbanization is causing problems for biodiversity as well, interestingly, because these Satayama systems have developed for such a long time alongside human beings that the biodiversity levels dip when people leave. But then in the majority of biodiversity-rich parts of the world, if that happened, if in Nigeria or Cameroon or Vietnam, if people suddenly reversed direction and moved from cities into the countrysides, you would have a very considerable net increase in the use of land in areas where land is being chewed up by agriculture in particular. That's more of a statement than a question, but I would just say that it does depend on where you're looking at, right?
And who would deny the right of a poor farmer in India who's barely making enough food from his small plot of land to keep the family alive, the right to move into the city and become a cyclo driver or something? Obviously, there is a need to think about what are the sort of the national problems and find national solutions. But in general, we're headed in the wrong direction. If 70% of the global population, as predicted, ends up in cities, then I'm really concerned about what happened to rural areas that are devoid of people and are not being managed in a way to regenerate those ecosystems.
I also think that, for example, if everybody lives in a condominium in a city, you actually will exactly fail to rekindle that connection to nature that Peter has alluded to earlier, that we have been severing over the last decades. And I think getting back to, in some ways, trying to incorporate activities that reestablish such a link are incredibly important, also to change our priorities and change the prioritizations. I'm not saying that poverty isn't a super big issue and basic needs shan't be met, and that still remains very important. But I do think that once your GDP per capita goes beyond a certain threshold, like let's say $15,000 or $20,000 or $30,000 per year, then I don't think it adds so much to your quality of life. There needs to be ways in which we can reconnect to that nature.
During the pandemic, we saw a lot of the people who had the possibility to move away from the cities do so. A lot of the people who could telework moved out of the cities, mostly, I guess, in Western countries, but in Japan as well, where there were a lot of restrictions. So people felt like moving away from crowded areas was healthier, but more so it's just revaluing rural areas and all the benefits that we get out of them.
Yeah, and the other thing, of course, is that there is opportunities within the cities to create parklands and nature reserves. The notion of a 15-minute city where you're no further away from a park than 15-minute walk. Those sorts of things also help to allow city dwellers to have some connection with the natural environment. Here in Bangkok, I walk through a park every morning on the way to work. And it's my favorite part of the day is to actually walk through there. This morning I saw a turtle in the water for the first time. There is water monitor lizards that are breeding there, lots of birds. And to walk through that park in the morning just gives me the lift that I need by the time I get to the office.
I totally understand that. And this would relate to, we need to change the way we work and the time that we dedicate to our work schedules, and we see a trend towards having 4 days of work. per week. And I think maybe this would allow more people to reconnect with nature, maybe start growing their own vegetables. Yeah, the more flexibility we have with our work, the more it allows us to reconnect with nature. But I guess this is from a very privileged standpoint where we are allowed to work in a more flexible place with our hobbies and our private time. So maybe if more people value this, and if it's normalized, then maybe it would be good. But
what do you say to someone who wants to work in environment but also wants to have a prosperous life? It's very much against the conventional script of a successful life, especially in Asia. I would say having a profession in the environment, it's not yet considered as prestigious or elite or at the same level as being a banker, a lawyer, a doctor. What would you say to that?
Through my career of working in the environment, I've actually been able to make a good living out of it. Surprised the hell out of me. I didn't think that would ever be the case. Nevertheless, I've been fairly careful about what I spend. I don't spend things on luxury items. I don't drive a Mercedes-Benz. I walk to work. And yet, I've made enough money out of being an environmental specialist to retire comfortably. So there is perhaps a mistaken impression that if you get a couple of $1 million a year, you're going to somehow be happier than you are working as an environmentalist. It's not money that gives you happiness. It's actually doing something you believe in. As long as you believe in trying to reverse the kind of environmental destruction around it, then that should make you happy. And provided you can make enough to live on, then that should be sufficient. When I left ADB, I was asked, what is the biggest lesson you've learned from working in the Asian Development Bank? And I said, the biggest lesson that I've learned, not only from ADB, but also prior to that, was nature has been around a lot longer than people. And nature has worked out solutions to nearly all of the problems that we're facing. And we're just too dumb to understand the kinds of solutions that nature has worked out. And I always give the example of a leaf. A leaf knows how to do photosynthesis without being told how. Scientists have been working on artificial photosynthesis for many, many decades and have still not cracked it in a commercial way. And therefore, I think the more we try to learn from nature, the greater opportunities we have to reduce the environmental harm that we do. Similarly, with a lot of our indigenous and local knowledge, there's a lot of knowledge out there amongst indigenous and local people, which we have not sufficiently tapped. And yet they have hundreds, if not thousands of years of oral transmission of knowledge of what works and what doesn't work from nature. Those two aspects, I think, are quite important. Let's learn from nature.
Thank you for listening to About Sustainability. Please subscribe at podcast.iges.jp or search for About Sustainability wherever you normally get your podcasts. If you've got feedback, you can review us on your podcast directory of choice or reach out on Twitter at IGES_EN. About Sustainability is produced by the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. Any views expressed during the podcast are those of the speaker at the time of recording and do not necessarily reflect the views of IGES. Thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. We don't take that lightly, and we hope you'll join us next time.